Hey folks, Harry here. I know you've probably clicked on this hoping to listen to an in-depth discussion on Alex Garland's film Men from 2022, but some shitty news. I fucked it. The project corrupted after about 30 minutes. So we have sort of the start of our conversation, and then after that, it's about an hour of silence. So, sorry, we're barely going to scratch the surface of this. We're going to post it anyway for the need to post something, I guess, every week. But yeah, it's only a fraction of what we recorded. Just a bit of a disclaimer. Enjoy the first 30 minutes of Cara and I talking about Men by Alex Garland, which is the film that kind of launched the idea for this podcast in many ways. But yeah, here's just like a fraction of our conversation. I hope you can enjoy it. All right, I will talk to you at the end of the episode.
Hello and welcome to A Bechdel Dysfunction, a podcast that dissects feminist films directed by men and discusses whether they are helpful or harmful. I'm Cara Strover.
And I am Harry Anderson. We are two film school underachievers who are heaps good at talking about movies, but not that flash at making them. We want to acknowledge that we are recording this on Wurundjeri land, and we'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We also extend that to any other First Nations people listening. And just as a heads up, we will be talking about lots of prickly things today, so just stand by for that and a little bit of a content warning.
This week's episode is all about Men, the 2022 surrealist folk horror written and directed by Alex Garland, starring Jessie Buckley, Rory Kinnear, and Papa Essendoo. My father once told me I have all the characteristics of a failed military man.
All right, Men from 2022, directed by Alex Garland, starring Jessie Buckley, Rory Kinnear, and Papa Essendoo. A young woman goes on a solo vacation to the English countryside following the death of her ex-husband. Things turn for the uncanny as all the men in the village appear to possess the exact same face. Cara, welcome.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us yet again for
always a pleasure.
A discussion of the film that launched this podcast in many ways.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Yeah.
It really is the genesis.
Yeah. So I guess to fill everyone in, Cara and I saw this movie in cinemas last year because I'd really wanted to see it. I'm a huge fan of Alex Garland. I'm like just a massive Alex Garland stan. Love his work was super hyped to see this. No one else was hyped to see this. And Cara was kind enough to come along with me, and we had a very interesting viewing experience and interesting chat afterwards. So, yeah, it's going to be a good one. This is kind of a conversation we've already had, but I think it's going to be pretty different second time around, actually, because this is the second time that we've both watched this film. Yeah. How did you feel about it this time around, Cara?
I think I kind of felt myself having like the same reaction. Because I remember, maybe we'll talk about the cinema for a bit, because I remember watching it with you at the Nova in Carlton, and it was one of the tensest cinema experiences I've ever had. And I could feel like...
This movie is so fucking scary.
It's scary. Let's say that straight off the bat. If you're one of our dedicated listeners who likes to watch the movie, maybe if you don't like horror movies, I would not recommend that you watch this movie. It is scary, and I'm a big horror fan, and I've been around the block, and I find this movie really scary.
Yeah.
The tension, like even when you take out the sort of fantasy, like eerie, folk horror elements, the tension build up in a lot of scenes where Harper, the main character, is like alone and then encountering men. It's top notch. It's really good, but it's hard to watch. So I remember being in the cinema just like wound tightly, and then I think often sort of turning to you with a feeling of, I wish I wasn't here.
Yeah, the dread is real. So it is very much a surrealist horror film. I think we should do a quick recap of the plot just to fill everyone in who hasn't seen this, because there's a lot of people who just haven't seen this film.
It's pretty recent, so...
Yeah. Do you feel comfortable to run through the plot very quickly?
Yeah.
You do this all the time. You're really good at it.
Oh, thank you. So we open with, like the synopsis says, our main character Harper, played by Jessie Buckley, who's going on an escape to the country. Shout out to my mum there if she's listening. He is going to stay in like a manor house in the countryside after a very traumatic event, and to sort of process and grieve. And while she's there, she kind of has these various encounters with different negative encounters with the different men that she interacts with there. So there's this sort of Jeffery, who owns the property, who's
your entry-level misogynist.
Yeah, she calls him a very specific type. And you know exactly what that means when you watch it. We should just start out from the beginning. Like, Rory Kinnear kills. He's so good in this because he manages to
he plays all the men.
He plays all the men, but he manages to make them all individual characters, even though they all look the same. But anyway,
just to derail you super quickly, so for people who don't know who Rory Kinnear is, you probably most know him from the very first episode of Black Mirror. He plays the Prime Minister who has to do an unspeakable act with a pig. So it's that actor. He plays every single male character in this film, apart from Jessie Buckley's husband.
He's Jeffery, the owner of the house where she's staying. He's what is kind of assumed to be a homeless guy who she is worried that he's being stalked, and he shows up naked in her garden, and she sees him sort of in the woods and stuff. He's the police officer who's, quite dismissive of her concerns. There's a scene, I was going to talk about this later, but there's this scene after, so the naked guy shows up at her house and sticks his hand through the door, and it's all very scary, and the police do manage to come in that scene, and he gets arrested, and she goes to the pub for a drink afterwards, and she walks in, and they all just kind of look at her for a minute, like as she comes in, and it's so... As somebody who's been a girl who's walked into a pub by herself, like I just sort of recognize that feeling. Anyway, and then pretty much from then on, it all just kind of goes into...
The third act is a fever dream.
Yeah, it goes into like quite surreal. So there's this sort of home invasion almost thing happening where all the men are sort of in the yard and are like chasing her into the house. Oh, the priest. I didn't even mention the horrible priest.
Yeah.
Horrible priest blames her for her husband's abuse and suicide. And all have these kind of little moments of attacking her in the house. And then, do you want to describe the last 15 minutes of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a true nightmare. Maybe we should hold off on it for a little bit, because so much of this film is up to interpretation, and that is the intention of Alex Garland. He's said that a lot in interviews about this film. He's been very close-lipped. Is that a saying? Is that something people say? He's very tight-lipped. He's been very tight-lipped about what this film literally means. He's given no personal explanation to it, so it's very much left up to interpretation. But it is, it's a wild, nightmarish body horror fever dream.
And throughout all of it, sorry, I didn't even touch on it, that we do have the flashbacks to the event that has caused her to go on this trip, which is when she announced to her husband that she wanted a divorce, he
threatened to commit
suicide. And then after invading her a classic sort of emotional abuse, culminating in a moment of physical abuse when he hits her in the face. She kicks him out of their apartment, and he forces his way into the apartment upstairs, and either while trying to climb down the balcony to get in through the balcony, he either falls accidentally or lets himself fall. And that ambiguity and sort of guilt is sort of something that plagues Harper throughout the movie, while also acknowledging the abusive tactic of it. You can't help but feel, obviously, guilt and remorse about something like that happening. So that's the kind of trauma that she's dealing with and processing throughout this whole movie, while then continuing to have these furthering traumatic incidents with the men that she meets in this town.
Yes. And I guess the final act, as this sort of like surrealist nightmare body horror sort of thing occurs, the various men of the village, played by Rory Kinnear, begin to display the same injuries that Harper's husband sustained physically after jumping off the apartment building. So, yeah, it's all part of her grieving process, I guess, but it's very much left up to interpretation. So if you haven't seen it already, I encourage you to see it and witness it for yourself. But more or less what we're going to do now is talk about what this weird surrealist impressionist film means to us. And I think, Kara, you should kick this off with, and I'll give you the question to kick it off with, but why is this considered a feminist film?
Why you could consider it a feminist film is that it's about, how am I going to phrase this right? Well, it's called Men, right? So interesting. I would say one of the ones unique to the other films that we've talked about that's not really about, well, that's not even fair. It's about a woman's experience, but it's also about like the class of men and problematic and issues of their behavior manifesting into like patriarchal structures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as we've mentioned, every man in this movie except for Harper's husband is played by the same actor, Rory Kinnear. And I think it's really important to like set out that this isn't a sort of a plot device. It's not supposed to be like, oh, it's like a magical village. Like that's not the point. The point is that actually I really want to quote like Mark Kermode because I thought he had a really good way of describing it.
Mm-hmm. Famous critic, Mark Kermode, friend of the pod.
My fave.
Yeah.
My fave, Mark Kermode, who I haven't listened to regularly in a long time, but
I love him. He's just a bit of a fucking dickhead sometimes.
I used to listen to him every week. I used to listen to the Kermode and May show every week, but then I don't know, I got life happened. But anyway, so he describes it as it's a device that is telling you something about the way in which either Harper perceives the world, or it's telling you something about the way that the world is, that on some level, on at least one level, all men are the same. All these men are the same.
Yeah.
So that's the point of it. It's not supposed to be like, oh, why doesn't she like notice that it's because it's trying to communicate something to the audience. It's a stylistic device. And I think in my opinion, that's the strongest sort of feminist credential because it understands sexism to be an issue of men, like capital letters, men, like as a group, as a class that hold a collective power over women as a group and as a class. And I think that it's a really just sort of neat and tidy and clever way to represent that.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. And I'd also say that each of the men that Rory Kinnear plays sort of represents varying degrees of misogyny, whether it be sort of like your entry level sort of like, best mate's dad played by this Jeffery character who's just like an old fuddy-duddy who's outdated from the country, who sort of just, assumes things, like is in a lot of ways harmless compared to others, but is so damaging in the way that he's unchangeable. Or you have this priest who has repressed sexual energy to like almost evil levels, or even perhaps in the most uncanny and frankly, personally, the most disturbing, a young boy that has Jeffrey Kinnear's face superimposed on top of him. Like that sort of raw, well, it's just that fresh misogyny that's like based in boys that they can't even explain. It's just so incredibly insecure. And then I guess
and also learned, right? Like
yeah. Well, yeah, more learned from just.
I think it's I think it's interesting too that he kind of encounters individuals that also are kind of representative of like systems. I think there's sort of an argument to be made that you could kind of read Jeffrey as like a sort of class thing as well, because he's the owner of this manor and kind of acting as her landlord. And he kind of takes on this very sort of paternalistic and authoritative role of like when he finds out about that she's had these unfortunate encounters and he comes to the house later, he kind of takes on this protective role. Like he's really trying to prove himself in that area. Mm-hmm. But then there's also, you know, an individual police officer that's also represents, you know, the difficulties of dealing with issues of violence against women in the justice system more broadly. Yep. And, you know, an individual really truly heinous vicar, but also representing sort of the misogyny kind of embedded in almost any organized religion. Mm-hmm. And I think with the kid, it's really that whole learned behavior that's just going to fester and develop more.
Yep. And I think there's one that we haven't really touched on and is incredibly ambiguous, but there's iconography of it all over the film, which is this naked man who we see in the forest, this person who's stalking Jessie Buckley's character, who, as the film goes on, embodies more physical characteristics of a figure known as the Green Man in like Celtic and Anglo-Saxon mythology. Which is sort of this symbol of the changing of the seasons and growth and life. And this sort of Green Man character, also played by Rory Kinnear, funnily enough, for me represents like this long-standing, perpetual, it's always been there, like misogyny that exists in nature and males in nature that is passed along. And that's sort of shown a little bit more in this final third scene, which I guess third act that we can talk about now, which is the physical birthing of other men, which is shown in a very particularly graphic and, as we discussed on our first analysis of this film in our private lives, incredibly, how would you describe it, Cara?
I think it's very misogynistic.
Yeah.
It's also, I mean, it's a very, and I was going to say this till later, but whatever. Let's just freeball it, whatever.
Okay, let's explain it literally first. What happens?
So in the sequence, after this sort of home invasion sequence where she has these incidents with him, the Green Man kind of appears in the garden. And then it does this sort of pan down or pan out and you like reveals his body, which is sort of pregnant to the state of grotesque. Mm-hmm. And then he just kind of squats down and it's a very full frontal shot of him birthing, I think.
The boy is
the first one.
Yeah. So and that's then, sort of like that passing along of that initial seed. Yeah.
And then this, you know,
then it's
slime and blood covered boy crawls for a bit and then another sort of orifice appears and then the vicar bursts out and then this whole kind of process keeps going on until I think it's Jeffrey, and then I think eventually this kind of manifestation of her husband climbs out of Jeffrey's mouth. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of weird, right? Because it's this horrible, grotesque body horror sequence. But it's also, to me, in my opinion, this is from a film critic perspective, like the least scary thing in the whole film. Because, and I remember watching it the first time and it happened again this time, the tension for me completely dissipates because I'm just like, this is stupid.
Yeah. And it's something we touched on thematically in Aliens with the physical representation of the alien queen, whereas the female form and birthing in general has been used to get a direct grotesque reaction out of a male audience, more or less. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. Which, again, like I would say our personal analysis of this exact scene is like, this is the kernel of the podcast. This is us talking about it. Because I think the most interesting thing about all of this is that as perceiving that as misogynist completely flew over my head at the time. Like I did not even fathom that until you brought it up when we were discussing it afterwards. And it was just a complete perspective that I was totally tone deaf to. And it's been a really interesting path for my personal growth to then sort of view films in that sense and see that sort of, I guess, that gorish physical representation used, among other things. But it was a real eureka moment in terms of us talking about films and me viewing films. So yeah, it's pretty interesting because I actually, in a lot of ways, I had a very profound experience watching that sequence. Just as a man who, in my adult life, I'm constantly trying to better myself and be more empathetic to women in general and try and be a better person, more empathetic and vulnerable and open. This scene of men birthing other men and passing along the traits, like the horrible traits that men from the past have had and from generations. Like I found that to be incredibly profound and moving. And yeah, it's just amazing, I guess, that we can have such very different opinions watching this film. And it's not that I am angry at you or anything about it. Like I really cherish what you have to say about this, but it was just genuinely interesting for us to feel so strongly in opposite directions about this.
Yeah.
Sorry if that was just a big old rant.
No, yeah, but I think even that, I mean, and I was going to sort of, this is going to be really free will and this is very stream of consciousness, this episode.
I think that's fine. Yeah.
But I think even, it hadn't occurred to me until you were sort of talking about it, this green man is kind of possibly trying to represent a sort of almost innate biological animal kind of misogyny. But yeah, I think that's possibly is the intention. But again, like for me, because I don't really believe I don't really believe in that in the real world. I don't really believe that men are misogynist biologically. I believe it's social, right? Like it's learned behavior.
Mm-hmm. So, I do agree with that, but I also think that it didn't just pop up one day. It wasn't just somebody who established society didn't just go like, you know what, we fucking hate women too. I think it's come from somewhere very physical. It's a very literal representation in this film, and I think it's very easy to scapegoat that. I completely understand why that would be like that, but these impulses have come from somewhere. And I think it's interesting that it's represented that way. But yeah, go on. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, it's just that I don't want to get into a whole thing about the origin of misogyny because honestly, I don't know enough about it. But I think
and I don't have anything here to back that up as well.
In the state of the world as it is, I think most of it is learned, it's systemic, it's cultural and it's historical. And it's almost, to me, a cop-out to say that it's biological because then it's unchangeable. Yeah, but I think that it is unchangeable. I think it is changeable.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I do think it is changeable, absolutely.
I remember when we saw this the first time, I think you said, like, this is a movie you think all men should watch.
Absolutely.
Do you stand by that?
Yeah, I really, really do, in the same way that I feel about Silence of the Lambs, in terms of the undisputable value of putting a male audience member into the shoes of an oppressed female character. And I'm really hesitant for saying male and female because I know there's better ways to describe human beings, but bear with me. I think that's so valuable to get someone to pick them up and put them in this terror to witness it firsthand. And I would also understand that as a woman watching this, there'd be a lot of like, yeah, I know you're preaching to the converted. Like I live this experience every day of my life, perhaps. But in a lot of ways, I don't think this film is for women. I think this is like in some ways just like a style guide from one man to other men to be like, hey, like this is what it's like potentially in a very hyper sort of advanced environment. So that's why I believe it to be strong. But I also understand that not everyone reads it that way, and there are many reviews.
Yeah.
Fight Clubs. The movie completely Fight Clubs.
Well, I was sort of interested by the reviews because I found there's sort of two camps of being, oh, it's just man hating, and it doesn't really mean anything, and then the other camp being like, oh, it's not, it's just trying to be feminine. It's just like a sort of Me Too movie. It's just riding on this wave. It doesn't really like it's not saying anything new. And I kind of, I mean, obviously I don't like the first one, like, because it's not a man-hating, well, I mean, maybe it is a man-hating movie, but that's not, you know.
I think also, sorry to interrupt you, I think men need to get over the concept of man-hating in general. Yeah. Like, let's get over it.
I found the other critique of it's not as profound as it thinks it is, or it's not as interesting as it thinks it is, or it's not saying anything new. I found that a bit like cynical, because I think I said this with Mad Max. I don't have a problem with like really just hammering it home, of just really just trying to lay it out, because if this was a sort of commonplace attitude and opinion, we wouldn't need the movie like this. It wouldn't have that reaction.
Yeah.
So I think it is important to still have movies that try and say something this sort of strongly. I think it might be good to have a woman writer, director, producer, editor, somebody there to maybe tap Alex on the shoulder and say, you sure about this? Yeah. So there's obviously a problem there. And I guess, I mean, normally we would sort of break this up and talk about like what's aged well and what hasn't. I mean, this movie is only a year old, but really for me, the last 15 minutes, they don't work as a horror movie, because like I said, for me, the tension just dissipates. I just get bored. I get frustrated. I don't find it scary. I find it stupid. And I find it pretentious in what I hope is the correct sense of that word, of this is a man trying to say something really profound about something that he doesn't understand, and using language that he doesn't understand. So just falling on his, like, stepping on the rake and it's hitting him in the face. So I find it pretentious in that way, of like placing this great importance of like, look at this sequence that I'm doing to like express, you know, the toxic rebirth of masculinity and misogyny, and just fucking not getting it. Like, and so he can't make that leap. So there's this real tension and frustration of this movie with me for that sequence.
Okay, and that's where the recording crapped out on us. So, yeah, sorry about that. I guess it's kind of lucky that it happened in a film that we're guessing a lot of people haven't seen. But, man, you missed out on some good stuff. We really got into it. Oh, well. That's just how it goes sometimes. Just as a heads up, next week we will be putting out our last episode for the year, where we will be talking about Muriel's wedding. So after that, we're going to take a break over Christmas and maybe come back in the new year with some new movie discussions, but also maybe not. We haven't made our minds up yet. So just sit tight. You've got at least one more episode coming. But until then, thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time. Okay, see ya.